My name is Andrew Seiffert. I'm the senior counselor at the Cyber Security and Infrastructure Security Agency in the Department of Homeland Security in the United States. And it is a real privilege to host what I hope to be a very exciting post-lunch conversation that I think is really going to bring a complementary discussion to the conference. And that is about what we see as the increasing interrelationship between cyber security, physical security, and the resilience issues that cover the entire spectrum of the type of conflict and competition that we're seeing in the world today. And the theme is focusing on the experience in Ukraine for precisely the reason that Ukraine represents an unprecedented example of hybrid conflict, one that I know everyone in attendance at this conference and around the world is closely attuned to, both in terms of supporting our Ukrainian partners and allies, but also in terms of observing, identifying lessons learned, and more importantly, developing not just policy responses, but operational responses to make our entire infrastructure ecosystem, as interconnected as it is, more secure and resilient. So I have on the panel, I think, a fantastic group of individuals who represent both years, decades of experience and leadership shaping the security policy landscape, but also with operational responsibilities presently for the security and resilience of infrastructure from not just cyber threats, but also all manner of hybrid threats that we see as increasingly interconnected. Obviously, this is important to my agency because, as Executive Assistant Director Mussington mentioned in his keynote prior to lunch, we're not just America's civilian cyber defense agency, but we are also the national coordinator for all risks posed to the continuity of infrastructure. We have to be attuned to these trends, and the experts that I think you'll hear from today will provide their insights in a conversational way about how these dynamics are affecting Europe, the transatlantic relationship, Ukraine, and the globe. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists. First is James Appathurai. James serves as Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Next, we have Heli Tiirmaa-Klaar, the Director of the Digital Society Institute at the European School of Management and Technology. We also have Oleksandr Potii, who's Deputy Chairman of the State Service of Special Communications and Information Protection for Ukraine. And last, we have Bart Groothuis from the Netherlands and a member of the European Parliament who in particular has influenced some of the important cybersecurity policies and regulations being implemented today. So given the theme, and more importantly, the unfortunate incident that occurred yesterday, the evening before last, I wanted to address a crisis-related infrastructure security and resilience that is capturing the world's attention right now. We are fortunate that Vice Chairman Potii is here, and I want to give him the opportunity to lead the beginning of the panel, to take an opportunity to provide perspective on the incident at the dam, the consequences that your country is dealing with right now, and perhaps your perspective on how this represents an aspect of the current conflict and the hybrid challenges that face infrastructure security and resilience in the current global security context.
Thank you very much thank you for presentation my country and my service. First of all, thank you for mentioning about yesterday act. I have official speech about this act from our president, our Minister of Foreign Affairs. I read this information. So, as all of you already know, the Russian Federation blew up the dam of the Kakhovka hydroelectric power plant yesterday morning. Ukraine considers this as a terrorist act against our critical infrastructure. This is today our panel. It is an ecological and technological act of terrorism. It was one of the largest reservation water in Ukraine. The flooding of the southern regions of our country, where before the Russian invasion used to live at least 100,000 people. 18 towns approximately and villages are underwater. The Kakhovka reservation was a source of drinking water for millions of people, different regions of Ukraine, Zaporozhye, Dnipropetrovsk region, Kherson region, Nikolaev region, and so on, and a source of water for farming and agricultural production. Huge areas are now without irrigation. Due to the decrease in the water level in the Kakhovka reservoir, there is always a danger of an incident at another critical infrastructure facility occupied by Russian Federation, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. This is the largest man-made environmental disaster in Europe in last decades. Thanks to all your country, your government for supporting Ukraine, but it is necessary to finally establish that Ukraine will be a member of NATO and European Union to bring back to peace to our country. And some couple of words about me, from me. Before yesterday, we see computer modulation. What do if, for example, we have strike on a nuclear power plant, we blew on hydro dump and so on. But unfortunately today we see impact, not computer modulation. This is real world today. Destroy agricultural aggregation system, damage healthcare system and big territory, damage of supply clear water for thousand people, and very quickly evacuation. Old people, young people, baby, children, and other people. And unfortunately, today we don't know which impact, how impact we can do on occupied territory when they don't information about the situation. So this is a bad example how we have a more complex independent cross-sector independent. We have catastrophic situation of the dam. After this, we have catastrophic impact of agriculture health sector, irrigation system, food and water supply for people, healthcare sector, and so on. This is a huge catastrophe and very complex, independent, cross-sectoral connection. This is a very important and very hard problem, how we can account to this cross-sectoral connection in independence when we modulate and when we analyze and evaluation risk and threat for different sector of critical infrastructure. This is a big problem, and you know, and this problem very hard to modulate and very hard to evaluate. And return to theme of cybersecurity sphere of critical infrastructure, and I propose turn of my presentation, and we should speak some themes about how we build a resilient cybersecurity system and critical protection, critical infrastructure in Ukraine very quickly during the after invasion, Russian Federation. Next slide, please. So my service has more than 100 functions. One is the function protecting critical infrastructure, information government resource, cybersecurity, national register and so on. We support 16 different systems. One of the system, cyber protection system for critical infrastructure and government information resource, and protection critical infrastructure system. We have 11,000 specialists, and today, unfortunately, 80% of these specialists is military men during the war. Next slide, please. We have a national cybersecurity system which demonstrates a good resilience during the crisis time. And strategic level, we have a national coordination center, cybersecurity center, who can coordinate main body of national cybersecurity system. This is military internal affairs, cyber police, security service of Ukraine, state SSIP, Ministry of Defense and Armed Forces, National Bank of Ukraine, and intelligence community. When we have a crisis time, a good cooperation between these different agencies can help keep of resilience and common control of crisis incident, cyber incident, critical infrastructure, government information resource, and another information system. Next slide, please. And next slide. Very quickly, according to a couple of months, we're building organizational structure and system protection critical infrastructure. SSIP, this is a national authority who coordinate sectoral authority, sectoral bodies, and functional bodies. Today we have 21 sectoral authorities who are responsible for different sector of critical infrastructure. This authority, this ministry and special agency work together close with critical infrastructure operator and critical infrastructure facilities. This system very harmonized and recommendation of Directive Europe Union. We realize this recommendation in our special law, and we every time we study your recommendation from ENISA, from Europe Union Council and so on, and very quickly implement in practice of organizational structure and operational best practice for coordinate between functional bodies and sectoral bodies, and give information for President of Ukraine, Parliament, and Cabinet of Ministers, and very quickly make decision, operative decision. Especially, I have every week a special report and special meeting of President of Ukraine, and give information about status each critical infrastructure facilities. Next slide, please. So on this slide, we can see different type of industries and sector who impact of cyber incident during the last 6 months. Today we have total more than 3,000 incidents, and we can send that incident happen in different sector. You can see most sector. This is commercial organization, public authorities, finance, energy, and public and local authorities. Very interesting. Public and local authorities this is a focus of hackers groups. Local authorities, we have incident when city community, large city, focus of ransomware attack, enchiffering of communal information system, and citizens don't have access to information about local service, about information of citizen, AGP, and so on. Next slide, please. And another slide, please. Next slide. You can see classified type of cyber incident, category cyber incident, and how often this incident occur in last time. Most incident malicious code, like ransomware and another code, who after realizing this attack, hackers have access to our system and realize different tasks. I demonstrate these tasks in other slides. So next slide. So, this is main goals of Russian hackers during the war. This is goals not actual, not only Ukraine, you can read this, but only another country. And you very good know how today cyber attack and cyber incident become part of more biggest psychological operation and conventional operation. This is cyber attack used for before conventional strike or after, and building of house, destabilize of situation of local region on all country, and use for intrude for political process, not only Ukraine country and another country, and so on. This is a main goal, and our experience and analytic this goal. For example, last goal to achieve the political ambitions of Russian government. Cyber attacks used for realized political ambitions. Next slide, please. This is timeline about most critical cyber attack during the last year. Start January, big cyber attack of public authorities. After this February, we have a serious cyber attack of public authorities and the Viasat, February. And after the March, cyber attack of Ukrtelecom, a huge telecom company, Imperial Regional Power Distribution Company, Black Energy example. Next slide. And today, we have most key challenges in this sector. You have this read. These challenges not only for Ukraine, for example, hackers group more activity, change focus from different sectors. These hackers groups use modern tactics for realize cyber attack and so on. Another huge challenge, we lack qualified professionals in this sphere. A lot of people, high quality professional is very small group, but today we need a very wide professional because focus of attack not only government sector, private sector, commercial organization, company from a different sector of critical infrastructure, but unfortunately in this company and this enterprise don't have sufficient qualified professionals. This is a new challenge today. And another challenge, not only Ukraine, I think, implementation of best practice of regulation and requirement, a good understanding why specialists this requirement, and realize this requirement on practice. This is, we can realize not only help from government side, but from private sector side. We need a very wide private company, big, small, and medium company, who gives services not only government sector, for another private sector, critical infrastructure, develop concrete approach for realization this requirement, consulting about this requirement, because this requirement a very technology and very systematic requirement, and ordinary people don't understand this requirement very good. Next slide, please. And on this slide, only huge, most important project for SSIP for building resilient structure for incident response, detect cyber attack, response cyber attack incident, and building capacity building our professionals and building regional cybersecurity competence center in Ukraine. So maybe my speech give a keynote proposition for discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oleksandr. So the types of incidents that you've described, not just the terrible incident from yesterday, but we're seeing kind of an increased relationship between what originally may be a cyber incident that has the physical effects that you've described, or in the kind of conventional kinetic space, physical incidents that can have cyber effects that can cause disruption to the continuity of our communication systems or our grid systems and things like this. This is increasingly the norm, right? And I think your nation, unfortunately, is in the midst of the sort of most unprecedented example of this. James, maybe from your perspective, given your portfolio, these concepts are not necessarily new of hybrid warfare, but we're seeing kind of the manifestation of this now in a way that I think demands great attention. NATO has been thinking about this. The fact that in all of our policies talk about the importance of resilience because of that interconnectivity of infrastructure that Oleksandr described. How is NATO approaching this issue of resilience and the milieu of hybrid conflict in Ukraine more broadly?
So thank you. How's that? Maybe I'll try this one. How about this one? Aha. Okay, so thanks for the question, and thank you for that those introductory remarks, because of course they resonate very strongly with us. So maybe just to outline a little bit how we're thinking about this issue. And we are, of course, looking very carefully at what's happening to Ukraine by Russia. We're trying our best to help, but also, like everybody else, we're learning the lessons. So a few lessons, and one in particular I would put to you that is not from Ukraine. One is, I think we can clearly see that certainly when it comes to Russia, they don't have any limits when it comes to attacking critical infrastructure. Leaving aside the dam, this has been a non-stop assault on critical infrastructure with the specific aim not just to undermine military operations, but to put pressure on the civilian population. And these are clearly in violation of the laws of war. So we need to prepare for a Russia or an adversary that will target critical infrastructure and does it without any respect for norms or laws. So that's where we have to pitch ourselves now. Second, you're absolutely right. What we've seen in Ukraine is that Russia has combined cyber attacks with kinetic attacks. That sort of started to come a few months in particular against the energy sector and the critical infrastructure to maximize the effect. And that's across the board. So that is clear. Third point is we are hearing from industry, and not just from industry, but public warnings from industry about increasing cyber threats to critical infrastructure in our NATO countries. A lot of it is disguised as ransomware, or it is ransomware, but hidden within that ransomware is Trojan horses for future potential use, and in particular targeting industrial control systems. So we know that ransomware is not just ransomware, beyond the very substantial effects that it already has. So, that's the context. A few other points of context. One is, I think, in NATO, we are now, I think for the first time, really focusing on some of the critical infrastructure beyond what nations possess to sort of take the overview of how much we depend on critical infrastructure, and in particular energy and data infrastructure. So just to give one little example, 95% of all global data flows go through undersea cables. There are millions of kilometers around the world of undersea cables. It is extremely difficult to defend. And just to give you an idea of the impact of a cut of one of those cables, every day, $10 trillion worth of financial activity goes through these cables. 40% of that is going between Europe and North America, so you can imagine for NATO, and it's not many cables that are carrying that data. So there is massive vulnerability in an infrastructure that is extremely difficult to defend. And if anybody wants to Google the Russian Undersea Research Program, if you want a euphemism, it is a decades-old Russian program to map out and threaten our undersea infrastructure. It's publicly available information, and we, of course, watch it very carefully. And that's just not data, but it's also pipelines, gas, and energy. Then another element, which is different, is of course that the ownership of this infrastructure is almost entirely in the private sector. It didn't used to be that way 40, 50 years ago. Now it is, and that includes tech giants like Facebook and Google. Google laid a cable across the Atlantic that cost them 1 billion euros to lay down. So we definitely need to talk to them. But then you mentioned electrification, and I think that that's a really important point. That was the one I wanted to highlight. I think we also need to look a little bit forward. We are moving all together from a internal combustion engine powered economy to an electrified economy across the board. Everything's being pushed onto the electrical grid. And the energy transition requires the adoption of green tech, but a much more diversified set of green technologies which need to be managed by AI. In other words, we're pushing everything onto the cyber platform. Our entire energy infrastructure and economies are going to be electrified and based on green tech, which, by the way, will depend on critical minerals coming from another unreliable supplier. So there are long-term threats to our critical infrastructure, which will be bigger, harder to manage, and more vulnerable because of their dependence on cyber. So protection of this infrastructure, cyber infrastructure, is going to get even more complicated and even more important. So what do we need to do about it? I'll set out a few thoughts, and I won't talk too long. One is we need to get the stakeholders together, meaning public and private, civilian and military. We have not done that very well in NATO until now, and for one reason is that we've always had this sort of peace, crisis, conflict step process, because it's very important for NATO not to do things too fast. So all our systems are designed to move carefully from one stage to another. And there's a moment when the civilians will hand over to the military to fight. But in cyber, it doesn't work that way. It's contested all the time. The military depends on the civilian infrastructure. Our Supreme Allied Commander, which is a great title, which I wish I had, depends on the private sector to know what the threat landscape is, et cetera. So we need to break down these barriers. And I can tell you, when we go beyond cyber infrastructure to energy infrastructure, the energy companies are coming to us now and saying, hey, we were prepared for peacetime. We are not prepared for crisis or conflict. We don't see the threat coming. We don't know what to do when we do see a threat coming because we don't have the resources. They don't have the sensor networks in place, and they don't have the repair capability for attack. So they need this closer relationship, so we're trying to build that. Second, we need to map out the infrastructure across all critical infrastructure, and in particular, focus on priority area of vulnerability. We cannot protect everything. It is impossible. So we need to identify where the critical nodes are, critical geographic areas, whatever they are, and heighten the protection there. And heighten the deterrence messaging and effect around that, meaning we make it very clear that if you attack our critical infrastructure, we take it extremely seriously and there will be a response. Third, we need more resilience. And that means cyber resilience, and we discussed that. It means infrastructure resilience. And this comes back to what I was saying about the private sector. We need to build in incentives for the private sector to invest in more resilience. And the EU is very important in that regard because it has regulatory powers that we don't have. But when we talk to Google, they say, we get it, but it cost us €1 billion. So if you want another cable for resilience, that's on you, or at least, they want to talk to us about it, but it's a huge expense for them. We need to enhance supply chain security, fourth point. 50% of the vulnerabilities that we're getting in cyber are coming from the supply chain side. And so there's a lot going on in that regard. I don't want to go on about it, but that's important. We need much better training of the people who operate all this critical infrastructure. And you talked about the municipal level. These are real vulnerable areas. 80% of successful cyber attacks, I'm sure everybody knows this, is from human engineering, right? It's people making mistakes or not trained well enough and not having enough trained people. So the Italian government has a really great program whereby to hire and retain engineers, they have agreed to give them the highest possible salary you can get in the Italian government. They get paid, a 25-year-old engineer gets paid more than the prime minister because that's the way they keep the people, and everybody understands that this makes sense. So that's another thing. We need to invest in new technology, AI, quantum, post-quantum key cryptography. That's very, very important. We need to check ownership and control of our critical infrastructure. Just to be very direct, China has acquired controlling interests in critical infrastructure, ports, airfields, and information technology across Europe in a huge number of countries. So are we sure that that's a good idea if push comes to shove? And then two final points. One is, from a NATO point of view, we need to work much more closely with the EU because of what I just discussed. And then just to say that we have created in NATO, the Secretary General has created a critical infrastructure coordination structure at NATO HQ, civilian, military, private sector coordination with the EU. So we're taking this much more seriously. And NATO allies have taken a pledge, a commitment to raise the standards of cyber protection for their critical infrastructure with clear targets, clear steps, clear grading to show how we can improve. So we're taking this seriously, again, in cooperation or coordination with the European Union.
Fantastic. So a couple things that drew my attention. One, obviously, the partnerships issue, which throughout the conference yesterday, in the other panel discussions, the theme of partnership and collaboration, not just with between multilateral groups, between bilateral partners, but obviously between industry and government, was really cutting across all of those. Another one was about advancing norms and standards. And on that note, I'm keen to look to Heli and Bart to talk a little bit about how the policy and legislative landscape is evolving in this way, in a way that we think is going to lead maybe to help drive more partnership, but then also to maybe break down some of those traditional barriers a little bit between the cybersecurity community and the larger defense national security communities, because the stakeholders for digital transformation and cybersecurity, given the implications of the infrastructure interconnectivity, have to be fully aware of the larger sort of strategic implications with this. So with that, I'm keen to get perspective from Heli and Bart on kind of how do we actually make this happen using these legislative tools and these policy tools moving forward.
Thank you for this very good question. And since I worked both in NATO and in the EU and in the national government, and now I am on the academic side trying to teach it all, I think what possibly we need to do in Europe is that we should maybe create some novel ways of partnerships, because so far, I think, before the war in Ukraine at least, we have been following different tracks. EU goes to legislative track. There is a bubble of different critical infrastructure and protection, cyber people around ENISA and all these more technical communities. They sometimes come together, like from the national cyber agencies, and they have very good discussions, very good exchange of best practices. But these are like cyber people from national agencies. They meet their military counterparts at home in the capitals. And because this is what the national policy coordination usually is about. And in the EU right now, most of the countries have a cyber strategy and some sort of national cyber coordination structure already set up. At the same time, the military cyber people, they sit in another corner, whether in their own capital or in the NATO formats, and they talk to each other, yes, in NATO formats. And they do not often meet these civilian counterparts that are coming together around the EU formats. So I don't know whether we should create a new format, which I think most of the people who work in international organizations don't like, because creating another forum and creating another format is not going to guarantee that this format is making efficient job in the end. But I think we have to learn something from the Ukrainian lessons here, because how quickly the different governmental agencies, military, civilian, the private sector. The public-private partnership was forged to help Ukraine in different countries, even in a large country like Germany. Suddenly, all people were able to come to one room and talk to each other, which I think is a very good example of how we have to use the lessons learned from this crisis situation and kind of channel this into our usual everyday routine procedures. And I'm very glad to hear that NATO has this kind of more operational cyber group now formed, because I think this, yes, was there, but not on operational level before amongst those cyber agencies on the EU side. And certainly the private sector needs to be part of it, because we absolutely need the private sector inputs there. EU, however, is still doing very, very useful job when it comes to cyber, because the NIS1, NIS2, Cyber Resilience Act, these are the kind of game changers, because this is something that any operational format cannot replicate. Everything what EU does with the legislative and regulatory changes hopefully will make our digital ecosystems more secure in the future. It's very slow, it takes time. It's very difficult to implement NIS2. I know that people in this room probably have to do it, and if I made a poll and asked you how do you envisage that in your company, I think many of you would ask, like, it's very, very difficult. In Germany, we have the small and medium-sized enterprises that do not have IT people on their payroll because there are no IT people found. The IT people, the cyber people you can find are already employed by their larger companies, and the small and medium-sized enterprises are not able to find specialists and experts. So we have like a major crisis of expertise in Europe. And this, of course, will only grow because our educational systems are not kind of harmonized by the EU. So you cannot ask all the 27 member states to suddenly prioritize these subjects. And it's up to the member states then how they do it. So I understand the frustration that maybe the parliament members in Brussels or commission people have on that front, because you cannot really go over the boundaries of the member states' competence. But I think we certainly have to be very innovative, because our adversary is innovative. The Russians have been mapping our critical infrastructure already for 25, 30 years, since the end of the Cold War. I am an Estonian who was in Estonian cyber business in 2007, and we set up our national cyber coordination and strategy after 2007 attacks. And we know how closely the crime groups and the intelligence groups were sharing information on their side. They are very agile, and they use the expertise very efficiently. And this is in the national doctrine. So it's now the wartime situation, and they use it not just in cyber, but against any other infrastructure risk or infrastructure objects, regardless of laws and norms. And therefore, I think we kind of need a bit more urgency to set up those more new and innovative response structures on both NATO and EU side. As an academic, I can now make these kind of promises, and I don't have to follow up. But I know that we are not there yet in Europe when it comes to proper, agile response.
So Bart, given the references to the NIS frameworks, your thoughts on this?
Cheers, thanks a lot, and thanks for inviting me here into beautiful Paris. And as before I came into Parliament, I was Director for Cybersecurity, more or less your stalemate, but then in the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And now I'm making legislation on cyber, and that's great. I feel very comforting that so many people are watching what we do, since getting it across in the press is very hard. I would say that mainly my main objective was we're in conflict. And it's not that we're in conflict with the Russians and the Chinese, but they define that we are in conflict constantly. Constantaneously, they seek, below Article 5, they seek confrontation. It's more an intelligence contest, like also being mentioned by my colleague, but it's also a contest like in economic coercion, disinformation, election interference, etc. We have to set something to counter that. And I think that there are three things I'd like to say. First, what EU and NATO should do in the next couple of months and years. The first is, if I go to Capitol Hill, I always tell to my colleagues there, we're not two separate security providers. We're one and the same. We're complementary towards each other. We've seen that in the Ukraine, the war that Russia waged against Ukraine. We were very effective, and Beijing saw that. Beijing knows that we are able, we're not decadent Westerners. We're willing and able to suffer a lot for our industry, for our people. We're not the ones you thought we would be. We're stronger than ever. And I would say if we do a new round for a new Secretary General of NATO, I would say that has to go parallel, side by side, selecting a new foreign minister, like say the High Representative in the EU, which is currently Josep Borrell. His successor and the successor of Jens Stoltenberg should be like Javier Solana and Robertson. Tandem. Across the world, showing the world that we're a force of power below Article 5, above Article 5. That's what we want in the world, to really be a force. And I would say that's the first. The second is, what, like you all said, we need a new concept of collective defense. If I look at state liability law, helping, for example, Ukraine, or if Lithuania currently is being coerced by China, or the Chinese would hit back for ASML, the Netherlands, where I'm from, are restrictive export controls towards China in that respect. If China would hit a small company, I would say we as a collective West, and I mean also our Australian friends and our Japanese and Korean friends and Canadian friends, we need to collectively respond to that. We can't allow this competition to escalate any further. The low cost, low risk, high reward calculus must be reversed. And the current state liability law says, which is developed post-Cold War, strictly in military terms, you can provide some logistic assistance, maybe some medical assistance or some intelligence, but that's it. You cannot make an unfriendly response towards China if it's not in your direct interest. Now that's 3 countries currently developing this law, which is good. First is, of course, Estonia, thank you. The second is New Zealand. And the third, I recently read a paper of the Polish Foreign Ministry. Their cyber diplomats have put forward similar statements. I look forward on bringing this further in the European Union. I've put forward a couple of non-papers and papers from my centrist political group. I want to see more collective defense. And then thirdly, the main task for Ursula von der Leyen's successor, the new European Commission, should be that we get rid of the country-agnostic approach. Because for every hybrid threat, the European Union has put forward, to the disadvantage of Putin and Xi and many others, legislation. The Digital Services Act, for example, to counter disinformation. The NIS2, of which I was rapporteur on. But many others, like foreign subsidies, foreign direct investment screening. But what are we doing? Aren't we overloading our businesses with red tape and bureaucratic nonsense? It's like we have a country-agnostic approach, saying we would screen any foreign direct investment here for our strategic sectors. That's not it. That's not it. It's always the same 3 countries. We are doing a lot of stuff against disinformation, election interference. Is that because Finland or something, or Mexico is attacking us? No, it's always the same 3 countries. And et cetera, et cetera. What we need to do is scrutinize, therefore, if you have an offensive espionage program directed against the West, if you oblige your companies and citizens to cooperate with that, if you do that extraterritorially, and your aim is to thwart and alter the liberal world order, which we thrive on, you're out. You're on this list. And that's what the European Union needs to do. We need to do, scrutinize that. So exchanges for students, scrutinize that from China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Make sure that visa and migration standards are being adopted to espionage, etc. You make sure that if you would have foreign direct investment or foreign subsidies, you scrutinize China, Russia, and Iran more than you do the rest. That's it. And Europe currently is not willing and able to do so because a couple of, let's just say it's Berlin blocking the way of thinking. And this is because of our dependencies on China and others. And we should get rid of that. The new political structure of the European Union must coexist and collide and be exactly aligned with the US. And last but not least, and I'll give back the floor, it's also a foreign policy instrument. If you would say to Mr. Erdogan, President Erdogan, who's recently been re-elected, congratulations, but if you want to be on this list, you're going to be extra scrutinized. Your access to the European market will be restricted. You behave, otherwise you'll be put on this list and you would have significant economic consequences. I would say it's also a foreign policy instrument. These are some of the thoughts to what is currently happening in the world below Article 5 and above.
Back to Oleksandr, maybe. So you've heard a little bit from the group. I'm curious about your sense as the actor in this space who is under most pressure, who has the most acute understanding of the types of threats that we're facing from these sorts of aggressive, belligerent global actors. And I'm curious for your response.
When we stay in the high pressure of aggression, in my opinion, very important some things. The first, strong hierarchy system of community, not resilience for this pressure. When aggressor use hybrid instrument and complex influence on different way, social way, cyberspace, conventional, political, and so on. We need building like mesh structure of community and mesh network structure for decision different tasks. So for armed force, hierarchy structure very good because this is a strong discipline command and realize concrete task. But for community, for another sphere, we need building more resilient structure. This is network, bridge structure, and good cooperation, have formal and informal connection, exchange information, a very fast reaction of a new challenge and risk and incident. Like volunteer movement, for example, and informal connection, different professional, give information about concrete crisis, concrete incident, and very quick collect information, collect specialists, and very operative decision problem. This is first. Second, during this full invasion, when we decision problem of huge cyber attack, we get very useful information from our partners. First of all, for government structure in other country, and second, from private sector. So this is a role of private sector in this war, very crucial on cyberspace. Every day, our response team have neformal meeting, letting about cyber incident, about indicator of compromission, different network in our infrastructure, in other infrastructure. We exchange information, we discuss this problem, we give our information for, especially from private company, get information from us, and very quickly reaction of problem. For example, a big company from USA, Mandiant, Google, Asset, another company from another country, from United Kingdom, Canada, and so on. And another factor, not only information of specific information. A big private company give us special software license and hardware, and very quickly restore a building and new infrastructure for defense our system. So the third moment, Very important now and future, transfer technology. And not only transfer technology, and transfer of knowledge and for specialists, because we have a high-level technology software, but this is software very complex, and if our people, our specialists, don't know how to use the software, how organize a new process, use this software, we cannot give a good result. So transfer technology, transfer knowledge. Why? Because if our network, our system will be weak, will be vulnerability, your system vulnerability too, because we have a global network. Today, very hard building of full isolation system, information system. So we have some system strong isolation, but this system very small and very specific goals. Another system, high open, building of open standard. You mentioned about industrial control system. Today, this is a new big problem because industrial control system use a special element, different use and different protocol, unique protocol in different system, but today the system connect by internet, exchange information, and today we don't know how many vulnerability in this industrial control system, because when this system design, architecture thinks that system isolated, use only one object, and will be work on reliability. But today, this is not true. So this is a new problem. You mentioned about supply chain. Yes, 50% of vulnerability from supply chain. The biggest cyber attack in Ukraine, not Petya, this is supply chain cyber attack. This private company give official license of special software for financial and economical, and hackers use supply chain line and one time start a cyber attack at huge. And bad example. What company have most impact from this cyber attack, not Petya, that start in Ukraine? Not Ukraine company. This is international company, because international company have a huge capitalization. And if you have huge capitalization, we have a huge impact. Next, so if you have problem supply chain, we need develop special requirement for private sector. But in other rules, government state prohibition impact of private sector. This is independent sector. This is a commercial organization. How government impact of for security in private sector? So if the private sector has vulnerability supply chain, if private sector company is critical object, so we need to develop special security requirement, give this requirement for private sector, and after this problem, how we can control security, private company realize this requirement, good realize this requirement, we increase risk, decrease risk from this private company. This is a complex problem, not only technical problem. And next, from this, very important, use a very good legislation. We need harmonized our requirement for best practice of European legislation, best practice NATO legislation, because this is organization, a very trusted organization. So all countries who harmonize this legislation automatically has a good practice and implement your national, own national legislation. And another, how we understand each other for cybersecurity requirement. Each country have a national tradition. Each country have a unique organizational system, and so on. But another side, we have a common space. So we need harmonize national framework of international framework and use a good practice from another country, for example, and use a best standards. Ukraine relies such ways. We study recommendation European Union, NATO, and USA, and analyze this cybersecurity standard and make decision implementation this recommendation in national legislation. Step by step, we transformate our security requirement and harmonized with European Union, United States, and NATO for different sectors. NATO for military sector, United Nations and European Union and USA for civilian sector and critical infrastructure sector. This is a good way because we use your experience, your capability, and implement in our practice. And next problem and very important next two things. First, workforce development, development of professional market for specialists, need building of short and middle training course because of long term we can use only basic fundamental education in university. After this, a long time each specialist need have a much more short course about different specialties of cybersecurity, and each time of get professional certification from qualification center. And very important for different countries, mutual recognition of these professional skills and framework workforce. And another thing, this is building more effective and resilience high education of this sphere, and building system education from child, young people, middle people, old people, and full cycle of for life, get a new information, get awareness, and increase competition of this sphere, because cyberspace, information technology today is part of our life. You know, our product, national product, DIA, a million people use this product, and during this war, DIA helped a lot of citizens get public administration service and abroad. When we across broad, when our people live in different country, we constantly have document, constantly have working financial instrument. This is IT technology and security technology for part of life. I use DIA maybe every day, because I have different service, different document, and demonstrate in Ukraine, demonstrating this document on traffic police, for example. So this is a good instrument. So I review short different task, problem, and branch for our decision, our common problem. It may be I demonstrate a short rollout about how we cooperate between biggest institution from USA and SSIP.
Maybe we hold for that, but anyone else, because with this group, we could talk all afternoon, I think, but we need to be mindful of the time. Oleksandr, before we do that, I know James wanted to, I think, make one more point.
Maybe 3 sentences. One is, overall, I think we've talked about technical and professional issues. I think it's worth just stepping back and saying that the greatest contribution we can make to our overall hybrid defense is ensuring that the Russian aggression against Ukraine doesn't win, doesn't succeed. If they fail, it will send the message that this doesn't work. If they succeed, Russia will be emboldened, countries around the world will take the lesson that it works, and we're going to get a lot more of it. So that's crucial, and that's military as well as everything else. That's point one. Point two is, just to flow from what you said, Bart, actor-specific approach from governments and from institutions is essential. We have shifted in NATO. And I can tell you, having done now and overseen the analyses and steps to take, they're totally different. Various actors do different things with different tools to different aims, and the only way you build resilience against those is to know who's doing it, why they're doing it, what they're targeting, and have specific measures against them. So I totally support you, and we've moved in that direction. Final point is on private sector. We really feel a difference, not just in the way we want to engage with the private sector, including companies I'm sure represented here, but a total shift in the way that the private sector wants to engage with us. Companies that leaned away from NATO or away from defense are now saying, oh, wait a second, we recognize that our security, our economy, our values are at risk, and we need to be part of defending it. And there's an opportunity now to build a totally new, in my view, relationship with companies from startups all the way to the big primes. And that also is to help them, because we don't want a situation where one CEO decides, because they control all the tech, that they help or don't help. Then they come after 3 months and say, hey, I paid for it for a while, but I can't pay for this forever. And that's a totally reasonable thing to say. But also, we also don't want the whims of a CEO deciding where a certain capability is applied and where it's not applied, and then they change their mind because they talk to somebody else. This is not a way to run a world that is more in crisis. So we need new rules, new relationships, but I think we have an opportunity to build them.
Great. Thanks, James. Heli or Bart, any final comments?
I'm coming back to this notion that we need more expertise and more, young, middle-aged, old people to bring closer to the issues of technology. And at a strategic level, at all levels, on technical level, on operational level, but also at the strategic level, because I have seen it many times how ministers and other important decision makers do not actually understand when we talk about hybrid and cyber issues. So I think we also could do some more work there. And of course, as a professor now, I'm doing it, but I think this is a broader issue for all of us. Thank you.
Cheers. My last 50 cents. Listen, I would say my first maiden speech in Parliament was about the protection of subsea infrastructure and cables. Like James just said, it was almost 4 years ago. And everyone was looking at me, is this a problem? Yeah, the Gugi Institute is doing it. They have close ties with Russian military intelligence, might be even part of it, I don't know. But, this is a real problem, and it's heightening our posture. And when I raised it in the European Union, there wasn't much attention going on. I know NATO was working on it, but there wasn't much going on. We have 2 ships in America repairing it. We have 0 in Europe. There's none investing. There's no real crossover between civilian coast guards and military attribution capabilities. This is a huge responsibility that is being addressed by some parties, but it's not sufficient, even close to what we need. And I think that this is one of the things that we need to put pressure on in the European Parliament in the next couple of months, and I will continue to do so, very importantly. And last but not least, let me just say, I think that there's plenty of strategy around, and there's brilliant minds here, and also from CISA and from the US, from us. There's so much strategy going on, but I think in cybersecurity there's only one way to win, and as if you formulate execution is the strategy. And that's exactly what Oleksandr is demonstrating. Execution is the strategy. If you get things across, get things going operationally, that's the key to success nowadays. There's plenty of brilliant minds. You need operational capabilities to actually execute something. I'd say that's the key for success in the future. Thanks.
So obviously at CISA, one of our big transformational efforts is all about operational collaboration. So we talk about partnership with industry, we talk about the big strategy things, but I think we would agree that driving partnerships and collaboration down to the operational level is where we learn the most. We build the strongest trust between partners when we're operating at that level as well. And I couldn't agree more. I know Oleksandr wants to show on the theme of partnerships and collaboration, operational collaboration. I think you want to present a video. Is that correct?
One comment. Very important thing, collaboration between bilateral and multilateral between counterparty institutions. We collaborate during this full evasion with high-level cooperation, different countries, Poland, Romania, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Estonia. From Estonia, we realize new technology of X-Road. From USA, we realize a new technology, threat hunting. From Poland, support for cyber command and certification laboratory, and so on. I can give a much more example how we very close collaborate and cooperation. But Ukraine today is hub cooperation between our country too. We use different technology, and we give give information experience how this technology work in during the war. What effective result. And we prepare a special media rolic about cooperation between AAACIP and our counterparty CISA. Please start the rolic.
The war makes Russia's aggression a daily routine for Ukrainians. Bombs, rockets, hacker attacks hit our lands. But we stand strong and with resilience as a result of enormous daily work of millions of Ukrainians. We keep performing our main functions: national cybersecurity, national communication systems, government and military communications, and critical infrastructure security. Developing our human resource potential and technical infrastructure, we strive to become more and more effective. And it's all working in close cooperation with our partners, both domestic and foreign, such as USAID and CISA, with whom we signed a partnership memorandum. We share knowledge and professional standards, learn best practices, and receive technical assistance. And we are very grateful for that, because the modern world is about power of unity. One space, common ways.
Thank you, Oleksandr. And I want to especially thank our distinguished panel today. I know it's the break time. If anyone has a quick question, we might be able to do that, or perhaps encourage discussion in the reception. Yes.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I'm Catherine Gabet, Deputy Director of Spectrum Monitoring and Enforcement in the National Frequency Authority. And I was wondering, when I saw hybrid in the title, I was thinking also that it would mean hybrid between cyber information security, in fact, information security, and anything which is related to jamming and interference. And maybe it's a question I would raise maybe to Ukraine and others.
Sorry, could you just repeat the object of the, was it radio interference?
Radio interference, is it something that is comprehensive inside the cyber, or do you, is it something that you would put in the hybrid part, physical part, and is it something that was tackled in this table?
I understand. James, maybe?
I think that's a great question, and I think we look at cyber in two ways. One is cyber attacks directly and cyber-enabled hybrid operations. And those include, as you quite rightly mentioned, disinformation. And I think that's probably a growing concern, and we were just talking earlier about generative AI and how that is going to sort of supercharge disinformation and political interference, and that's going to be cyber-enabled. I mentioned attacks on our critical infrastructure, which will be cyber-enabled, but I think one of the things that Ukraine has experienced, and I just give the way we've looked at it, he's obviously more expert, but there's 3 ways in which cyber has been employed against Ukraine, principally, and against the rest of us, maybe a little bit less. One is direct attacks, taking things out. And then there's been a lot of discussion of how effective that's been. Second is espionage, and actually I think there's a lot more activity in the espionage area to get information back about individuals, about what plans are, about mapping out vulnerabilities. That's happening against all of us. And then the third aspect is indeed disinformation, and we need to work on that across the board, and that's very much national responsibility. So I'll give you one example where it's way outside of what NATO can do, but we know that Russian disinformation, for example, has targeted Mexican websites. And why? Because millions of Americans get their information from Spanish language social media, and that way they can get in through the back door. So it's far beyond technical solutions. It requires government to cooperate in areas beyond NATO's, of course, responsibilities.
I'm sorry, I was also thinking of just jamming, like GPS jamming, these kind of things, where it is always difficult to say, is it cyber, is it not cyber, but at the end, where it's important to be tackled.
It is, because these are connected devices, ultimately. We see this in the supply chain aspects of software, making sure there's security by default in those devices, so they can't be co-opted, can't be used for purposes that may be unexpected for the user. So I think absolutely. Your question, I think, goes right to the point of the theme here, which is that we need to stop thinking about the individual sort of dimensions of these sorts of competition and conflict spaces. These are now almost regularly integrated. And so if you're taking a look at a problem without thinking of the cyber dimension, even the sort of more edge cases for that, you are probably lagging in kind of where you need to be thinking about how to approach risk management for these sorts of threats. Okay. Did you want to?
Thank you. Very quick question. So on local government level, for example, you have a lot of crisis managers that are very experienced in handling other type of crises. Do you have any best practices on how to upskill them on the cyber dimension and how an IT crisis may be different? So maybe is this a pool of people that we can use actually for the future, or do we really need completely new specialists for this?
I think this is a very valid question because we are all in different countries in Europe trying to kind of set up a system how we could have like a cyber reserve or the pool of people that can help. What we did in Estonia already a long time ago, after 2007 attacks, was we understood that our best cyber brains might not be hired by any government agency, but they are somewhere outside in the private sector, in the development teams or of the companies and so on. So what we did, we set up the cyber reserve, which was kind of crisis management, but it was also a vehicle for reproducing the best practices and expertise to the larger groups in different parts of society. And this kind of voluntary-based cyber reserve type of experts who came together, shared best practices, they also trained the new generations. So that was a solution of a small country that doesn't have lots of resources. Of course, in a larger country, possibly there are other ways to do it, but I think at the local level, this could be also a good example for Germany or France.
So, Heli, I know for logistical purposes, I want to make sure I respect James's time because I think he has an appointment. So we can excuse James and continue the conversation. Bart, I know you want to make another point, but I want to respect the time of our folks.
Very short. So the thing I'd like to mention to your question is, in cybersecurity, I was acquainted with the information sharing and analysis cells, ISACs. You have that in the US. Sectoral cooperation. We don't have such thing in the information sphere, in the disinformation sphere. Why is that relevant? Think about President Obama's last interview in 60 Minutes. And he mentioned, my biggest mistake, what is your biggest failure? And he said, I thought that social media platforms were a force of good. And now I see it's also a force of evil because it divides us. There's more hatred. Our democracies are being undermined. Now, the US, and I'm a great transatlantic, right? But the US is not able and capable of governing this space. Trump wouldn't do it. Well, Obama called for Trump wouldn't do it, obvious reasons. Biden didn't have a majority in both houses. It has to come from Europe, and we have the Digital Services Act. I've put forward some 8 amendments, and that's why this is relevant for the ISACs, to get information from these platforms, whether it's in Silicon Valley or in TikTok. You need to get information about foreign interference to what we call legitimate access seekers. And I called it that way because it was in the NIS2 as well, on domain names. And what is it called? Is it academic, journalists, but also law enforcement can have a grasp of who is registering these domains, what kind of information, what kind of session cookies, what kind of Bitcoin addresses are you using, what kind of browser fingerprint do you have, so they can correlate these. And it's about democratization. It's a democratic debate on disinformation. It's not there. Now we have to trust, let's say, the FBI says it's the Russians, and Donald Trump said, could be Russians, could be the Chinese, could be a fat kid. No, it's not that. It has to be a democratic debate. Mueller investigated, but he didn't find that much of evidence in the information domain. You know why? They don't have the information from Silicon Valley. Boris Johnson sent in House of Commons a very bad signal saying, I don't want to investigate Brexit and Russian interference. It's a strategic victory for the Kremlin. That their stupid democratic decision to leave the EU could have been influenced by the Russians. It's a strategic victory for the Kremlin. I put forward these amendments on the Digital Services Act and never ever let that happen anywhere in the European Union. We want to know the extent of the Russians, and we will have the democratic debate on it. It's also about waging war, waging the conflict against our adversaries.
With that, I think we'll conclude the panel. Thank you to the panelists. We will continue the conversation in the hallway. And I really appreciate the panelists' time, of course, and our audience. Thank you so much.
I know she said it's alright, but you gon' make it up next time.